Yo, welcome to the first sit down with Skriv, the first episode. Oh my goodness. Amazing stuff. This is an interview show where I'm looking to bring some interesting guests on, of course, asking them questions kind of about what drives them, why they do what they do. That's the general energy that I'm looking for. Some of the guests that I bring on probably going to get them to give a brief overview of, why they got into esports, like how they got into esports, that kind of thing. Maybe if they're people who've not been interviewed at all before, it'd be nice for them to just give us a brief history. Got ideas for this as well, like the cold open. This week I'm really busy with work. I wanted to get this out because I have been sat on this interview for a while now. But in future, definitely, got a green screen, got some ideas up in the noggin. When we can get that out, pen to paper, so to speak, and I do get some time to actually record a good chunk of funnies, then these will get a bit more entertaining. But for now, just a general layout and information time with Skriv. Just very quickly explain the format. Obviously, it's an interview show, so there's like the first section, questions to do with what they do, and then all my guests in the second section, I'm going to ask them the same 10 questions. I'll put like a link, or maybe just the 10 questions in the description of this one. But it comes from inside the actor's studio, not my idea, but then, it wasn't fully his idea either, so... But yeah, James Lipton, he used to ask all the cool actors that he had on the show the same 10 questions at the end. So I think that's kind of a cool idea, just to draw some parallels between the guests. My first guest is Pr0nogo, content creator and producer, I suppose, within the CS scene. And we delve into some of the things about how he got into it, why he made this pivot to content creation after about a year or so of being a producer on some podcasts and whatnot. But in the summer of this year, in August of this year, he decided that he was going to start make some content. We talk about the originality of content creation. How do you come up with your own ideas? How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep it cool? And how to work with your guests rather than against them, in a sense. You pull them in and talk about topics that they are familiar with and delve into who they are as well. He's kind of in that similar vein as myself. The first question I asked Pr0nogo was why he moved from being a watcher of esports into a creator and producer of content.
Yeah, the most of the stuff that I had done prior to 2019 was just essentially hobby stuff where there wasn't much profit from the production of Speaker's Advantage, to be fair, but there was no sort of incentive outside of, it was just something I was passionate about. And that stuff was, for the most part, it was like game design, podcast related content where we're going through and deconstructing certain things about community content in the Brood War space and drawing parallels to the esports space. So for example, like one of my main focuses was how do you make a single player campaign or set of missions that still instills some sort of confidence in the player who plays them to actually be able to play in multiplayer, because the common refrain from the Brood War community is it's too hard to get into. And one of the ways that we try to make that happen is, well, we take away the pressure of online, we try to push them towards still having to play a really good game, like in terms of their own skill level. They have to play up to the skill level of the artificial intelligence opponents and figure out how to do that. So that was like one of the main contexts going into my sort of more shift towards the CS side of things, is that I at least cut my teeth doing stuff that for the most part was incredibly niche. Not too many people were taking a look at it. And as a result of that, I was able to almost like make all of the mistakes that you might make when you're starting out doing stuff that is not going to catch as many eyes. Then you can jump in. And this is actually a bit of a topic that Thorin himself briefed on one of his own videos, where he talks about getting started in the interview space specifically, and how if you start out by interviewing people who aren't as well known as some of your future guests, you can kind of make your mistakes with those early people. You can maybe ask the wrong kind of question or phrase it a little bit incorrectly, or just do something that in retrospect afterwards you'd be able to look back on and say, oh, actually, here's some ways that I can improve. And the best part is nobody's going to call you out on it, realistically speaking, because the person you're having on is just happy to be interviewed, and everybody else is just kind of interested in that, smaller star, so to speak. So that was essentially how I got started in terms of production, because I would have people on webcams, or I would have, to audio balance things after the fact. And when I saw that some people were looking for Speakers Advantage actually sent out a tweet at some point in, I believe it was August of 2019, but it might have been even earlier than that. They sent out a tweet from their official Twitter account that said, "We are looking for a producer." And so I hopped in their Discord and I said, "Here's my sort of details." And eventually I got into an interview space, and I guess there weren't that many candidates anyway, but after I did the interview, the word that I got back on was, "Do we even have to do the other interviews? Let's just get this guy on." So it was a nice welcome into the esports space for production. From there on, it was just something that, in general, I was enjoying being behind the curtain, sort of doing the recording and then eventually streaming stuff. Obviously, it opens you up to a very different can of worms where you might have to be I was actually a speaking producer, similar to, I guess, Sam Davies over in the by the numbers space, right? So everybody's familiar with them. The meme was that I was the budget Sam, which was perfectly fine by me. It was pretty funny, I thought. And what we ended up getting out of that was, like, every now and then I'd pipe up. And so that was sort of my very, like, mild sort of putting my big toe in the water just to test the waters, see how things are. And that was essentially my first sort of foray into the CS space. But it was definitely off of the back of making some of the more niche content that just wasn't as there wasn't as much interest in. And as a result, I could sort of make those mistakes like we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, for sure. I think, this is my first one, so I totally understand where you're coming from, right? It can be a little difficult to streamline it all and get it all clean. But so moving from producing, right, obviously you still do that. You work on its server time, which is a current still running. I think Peaks Advantage, they do one every now and then, but its server time seems to be much busier. There's more people on it and whatnot, generally speaking. From there, though, on the production end, what made you want to make this shift into creating content yourself? Because I think immediately, a few months ago, around August time, right, you start doing this, and you can notice if you watch a video now, for sure, that in a short space of time, even if you go back and watch the earlier videos and whatnot, I think from the get-go, you had a very clear plan of what you want to do, and your interviews come across quite naturally. I suppose that goes back to what you're saying, cutting your teeth on some slightly smaller, lesser-known projects and things. But coming into this, it's definitely had a big impact. So I feel maybe you have wanted to do that for a while. What suddenly made you finally make the shift and finally start recording your own content?
So one of the things that I always struggle with when it comes to sharing my personal opinions online is, especially if it's not an area of my own personal expertise, I basically have the inverse Redditor syndrome, where I actually don't understand why anybody would want to take my opinion seriously unless I can convince them of that. Whereas obviously the parallel I'm drawing there is a lot of the people who are posting and, following up on people's tweets or posting in Reddit threads, they don't try to convince you at all that they're credible. They just pretend like you already think that. And so that's how they share their opinions. So because of that sort of like the way that you could call it an insecurity, you could call it a way that maybe it's just I'm recognizing that I should be more developed in the space so that I can actually provide value, what I would believe to be a value. Because of that, it basically stopped me from wanting to make my own solo content for a very long time. And as a result of that, I think for a while, I sort of was just beating around the bush, and only inevitably later on would I start to actually work on content with, getting somebody on for an interview, like you were saying. And when I finally was able to rope in Davey, one of the hosts of Speakers Advantage, to get on and be the first guest of my interview show, that was when sort of the ball got rolling. I realized I could leverage the limited but still potent connections that I had made by doing the production job of Speakers Advantage and say, hey, some of those guests might want to come on my show, or maybe they'll at least do it just to do a favor for a friend, and we can see where that goes there. And then hopefully that's like all the shot that I need. I can take that opportunity and I can show people, other potential guests, and obviously the audience as well, that the interviews themselves have some merit to them. They kind of stand on their own grounds, and it's essentially just me getting some insight from the guest by virtue of my questions being asked and the sort of the pacing therein. So one of the main things that stopped me from doing it up until that point was essentially the thought process that why would they say yes to me asking them to come on an interview? It's a similar sort of extension of why would anybody care what I have to say on a topic if I can't even convince myself that maybe I have something of value to say. So essentially I tried to use that in a way that would actually empower me, where I would be going in and really studying aspects of the game so that I was actually well enough read on a subject so that I could share some valuable opinions. And one of the things that I kept coming back to is essentially looking at some of Thorin and Richard Lewis's videos on about essentially making it in content creation or esports journalism, or however you would define that sort of space, and getting their opinions on some of that stuff, as well as the fact that I've just been following content creation in the esports space for a very long time. It allowed me to realize what I wanted to see more of in the space. And that gave me an idea for an angle that I could take to essentially produce some sort of content that would not only have its own objective value, we could say, in a vacuum, but also comparatively to every other piece of content out there would have a different angle, a unique angle on it that you could say is, you're not going to get this kind of content from anywhere else, because your content can have value, but if it's not different enough to stand on its own legs, that's almost like its own kind of value, in a sense, where people aren't going to be that interested in jumping in and taking a listen if your stuff doesn't do something that they can't get anywhere else. So it was a combination of eventually getting to the point where I felt competent enough to, or confident enough to at least make take a chance and see what I could actually do and apply myself in that respect. But also, combination of that and getting people who would say yes based on my connections with them. Obviously, initially Davey and Maui Snake, and then eventually parlaying that into some bigger name guests. I mean, I was able to add, once I started producing Server Time, I was able to leverage connections with some of the guests that we got on there. Like, I think it was the same time that Hawka came on as a guest for, I believe, the third episode or second episode of Server Time. He ended up being one of the early adopters of my interview series, where I was just able to say, hey, you know me from that show. Obviously, I did a production job there. So I was able to reach out to him on Twitter basically after that. So it was pretty, it was essentially like a nice way for, as the more opportunities you take, the more chances you take, basically. If you do well enough initially based on merit, the more opportunities you end up getting. It's a rich get richer kind of world, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose I'm hoping to get on that journey as well, honestly. Part of, you mentioned it a little bit already, but part of the angle that I want to come in at with this kind of series from the get-go is sort of like the drivers and whatnot of why it is you do what you do within the esports space, right? And I think we'll touch on some of the other areas, but for now, when it comes to the interviews, when it comes to the content that you're, I suppose, mostly producing, right, the semi-pro stuff is, I would say, more focused on analytical characters, if that makes sense. More focused on talking about teams and their effectiveness and whatnot, and certain players. Is that the area of the game that I suppose you're attracted to more so than, I guess the bigger pictures of like little shoulder content and other areas? Is it like the nuances of Counter-Strike, for example, the game? Or is it more so that, like you say, you're leveraging those contacts and whatnot, and it just so happens that most of them are more analytical?
I would say the latter is more so the case, but only insofar as I just haven't had the opportunity to bring on somebody like maybe a star player or somebody who's just more of a bigger name player in the space. Obviously, I've had some big names on the show, like Thorin and Richard Lewis, who I never imagined would say yes so early, especially since I didn't even, like, I'll put it to you this way. It really showed me that the space was a bit different than I had internalized. When one of my first 10 followers was a follow back from Thorin, I was like, wait, what? Like, how is this even so easy? And I mean, at the very least, I'm also a patron of his, so maybe that had some, connection there where he knew me from that. I don't know to what angle that had a change or a connection, but ultimately, when you get sort of like instant recognition, or at least an instant follow back from people who you've been following yourself for a long time, it almost is like, wait, it was actually that easy. All I had to do was reach out to them and send them a message in some capacity. So I thought that ended up being a nice eye opener. But to your point, like a lot of the people that I do have on for the interview show, they do have a bit more of we'll say a thinking man's approach to the game, or to breaking down the game. And that is probably because you have to do more work. It was something that I found out when interviewing some people for the mapping series that I do, the Hammer Meet Anvil interview show, where I talk to some of the mappers in CSGO. When you don't have a guest who's going to give you more in-depth answers, because a lot of those people have never been interviewed before, so it's their first time coming on a show like that, you actually have to do more work as the interviewer, is what I've found. You have to essentially say, hey, this person isn't going, I've got to ask loads of follow-up questions. I've got to ask, more questions that maybe they'll be able to answer. I've got to know when to pivot from a question that they don't seem to know the answer to, or that they're talking around and they're not really sure how to broach the subject or something. You got to kind of have to do more on the interviewer side to make the content worthwhile. And I think it's probably a good thing that I didn't start out with more people that were like that, because I mean, I think the most people who you would imagine would be like that are, even though players have done a lot of interviews sometimes, a lot of their answers are often going to be relatively short. And maybe they're more accustomed to like those post-match interviews that only last 10 minutes anyway. So they might not have done a lot of long form interview content. We've had some players who have come on talk shows, like Yukinder recently came on It's Server Time episode, and he was great. He was very well spoken and had a lot to say. And it wasn't just that he was willing to give long answers, but he was actually very emphatic about sharing his own personal opinion. And that's like kind of the best thing that you can hope for, especially for a player. For the most part, I don't think you're going to get that out of players. And I also think that it's been notorious that it's really difficult to get players on the show anyway. So in order to actually get somebody like, I've reached out to a number of different players and I haven't had any of them say yes yet, but you almost have to just like continuously ask some of the same ones over and over again, a bunch of different ones just once. If you just incrementally get there, maybe some of them will follow you back instead of necessarily responding to you. Like that's happened a few times. And then you just, you a month later or something like that, you hit them up with another message again. Or maybe you wait for, maybe they change teams and maybe then they want to talk about some stuff that previously they weren't going to be able to share comfortably or something like that. So I guess it's just more complicated to get somebody like a star player or somebody who's maybe a little bit less analytical or introspective with how they consider the game. It might be a little bit more difficult to get some of those younger guns to come on the shows for really any capacity. But what will undoubtedly end up happening is that the more you do these interviews with people who can give you long answers or people who do have that analytical slant that they see the game through, I think the more you start to understand their perspective, and it gives you a bit of a grounding to at least know, all right, this is sort of the baseline for how I want some of my interviews to go. Let's see if we can, accomplish this going forward for other things. So ultimately, I guess it was probably a happy accident that a lot of the contacts that I had, like you said, just happened to be more analytically minded. Of course, I was almost like cheating when I did my first couple because I had a bunch of rapport with Davey and Maui Snake. I had talked to these people before and after the Peaker's Advantage episodes. Obviously, sometimes I would talk during them as well, and there'd be banter and stuff like that. So we already had a good set of rapport, and it was actually in some ways almost an eye-opening experience there, because you almost don't want to have too much banter or funny moments if the interview is meant to be like more of a grounded, serious topic. In some of the cases, like I think in the very first interview that I did, if I had to reflect on that, I would say I probably didn't do a good enough job of like curtailing the conversation to, acknowledge the humor inherent in some situations, but not lay into it as much, because a lot of the times we were talking about things like the CSPPA and, essentially some big name industry topics. At the time, the Neon partnership with Blast was still in consideration and they still hadn't announced anything about that. So like some of these things are real issues that concern a lot of people. And if you don't end up having the opportunity to acknowledge the severity or seriousness or gravity of the situation, then it might seem almost like you're too aloof in the eyes of some people. And in general, it might just distract a little bit from what the merit of the answers actually are. So yeah, I think a lot of the times it was, so I had some nice analytical minds on the shows, and I was able to mostly do that based on the fact that they were already who I had contact with. And it's almost like when you start to talk to their friends, they tell their friends, or the fact that you're sort of associated with those analytical minds will make it so that more other analytical minds are more likely to come on. And that's how I got like Alan Hender on one of the episodes of Metal Makers. That's how I was able to get a lot of the people, Launders and so on, who were able to come on the show in one form or another and talk to me about their ideas about the game. And yeah, it was definitely it's been a fun experience. I definitely still have aspirations to go into that other section where I'm more responsible for not necessarily carrying the show, but getting more out of the guest. And maybe they do end up giving me a little bit less in terms of like the longer answers, like this one has been. So I do have some aspirations for that, but it just hasn't manifested yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally down to let you talk. Right, it's interesting to get the insight, especially from someone who, has already started on this kind of journey and has a lot of the experience already. And then I suppose now you're on the other side of, so it's good to get a bit of an idea of the philosophy and the approach that you have. So again, just to kind of pull from what you're saying, right, very much towards the end there, I'd thought about it for quite a long time while you were talking, but certainly with different shows with different kind of goals to them, right? The map designing stuff, which we'll touch on a little bit later, is a lot of fun and certainly something that not a lot of people look into, right? And always an interesting area. But I'm just kind of wondering if the long-term aspirations are there, right? Like I say, you kind of touched on it towards the end, so it looks like I'm literally, but is it something maybe, I don't know, you would move into event work, or is it always going to be content creation online that you're trying to do? Are you aiming to turn this into, something that you can do for a very long time, becomes all profitable, and becomes your life work, so to speak? Or is it more, you think, going to stick around that sort of hobby area, doing it because you're interested in speaking to people in the space and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sustainability, the angle of whether or not it's something that I could even do for a long time, the desire is there. I would love to do it for a long time as far as content creation goes, but I have been thinking a bit about sustainability. So obviously we've all been dealing with this pandemic that's hit, and some lockdowns are, some areas are more locked down than others. One of the benefits that I ended up getting as a result of a lot of the sort of unemployment benefits and whatnot that hit, as a result of losing some opportunity to just do the traditional employment that I was doing up until the time where I started on this content creation job. I was able to essentially pool up my savings and beef that up for a while. And eventually that's going to expire, and I'm going to have to go back into the workforce, obviously, assuming this sort of thing doesn't stick around in its own right. I don't really know how best to phrase my ideas that I have about sort of the Patreon angle or something like that. That is something that I'm willing to explore. And that's pretty much the only thing that it would stop me from making content as consistently. I don't think I would ever stop entirely. It's just that obviously if I'm working, I'm not going to be able to also do the content on the side, right? So I think the way that I would try to describe it is I've always tried to conceptualize anything like Patreon or fan donations or anything like that as payment for services rendered, because all this content is free. Obviously my channel itself isn't even monetized on YouTube standards, but even if it were, it's like a couple pennies or something per every however many views. I don't know the exact metrics, but I know it's not going to be much anyway. So at best, maybe it would pay for your grocery bill 1 week or something like that, and every so often that would be something that you'd get as in theory, a freebie. But it's not really a freebie for you, because you've been making however many videos for however long, you've built up the audience for however long. And the content creation space is almost like you're creating all this content, people are consuming it. Some small portion will be willing to support you financially. The rest of them might be willing to support you by like sharing your videos or simply just commenting or doing whatever else the algorithm demands. And when it comes to a situation where the financial support kicks in, I would always like to conceptualize it as like, I've enjoyed your content for years. And this is how I conceptualize it when I'm doling out some sort of donation for a viewer or a content creator rather. And it's a similar sort of approach. Is like, I've been watching content from this guy for X amount of time. It's added X kind of value to my life. I've thought about like, this, that, and the other thing as a result of it. I've seen this kind of value from it. Here's my payment as a result of that. And that's how I've tried to think about it anyway. So when it comes to looking at it for the long term, I'm not going to rule any other ideas out. I did actually apply for the one of the recent DreamHack things where they rolled out and said we're looking for an analyst, and I think at the end of the day Vu ended up getting selected for that, but he might have already been on. I'm not actually sure who won that. That whole process was actually kind of confusing for the back end, but ultimately when I did that application, that was also me sort of like I was saying earlier. You almost have to just like give something a shot and see if it works out. And if it doesn't work out, you just keep going with another shot later on. That was almost the same thing. It's almost like sending Richard Lewis a message to ask him to come on your interview show when you have like 30 followers on Twitter and maybe less than 100 subs on YouTube or something. It's like, I'm not really expecting any response. I shouldn't even really expect a response logically. Maybe I'll get one though. And so when I sent out my application for DreamHack, it was actually there was no past experience I've had on events. I was never in a situation where I was an analyst for Counter-Strike. I wouldn't even really consider myself now to be in a position where I could give you like really detailed analytical breakdowns of here's a team's weakness, here's a team's strength. But I could definitely sell you on the matchup. And that's where I knew my strength was. So I guess maybe in that sense, it would probably be better if I was a host or something, where I could ask specific questions similar to my interviews or talk shows, where I can try to hype up a match ahead of time by asking the analyst who I know can break it down in a factual sense, to sort of reinforce whatever narrative I'm trying to push. But since my specialty in theory was supposed to be an analyst for this job, I just sort of tried to reconfigure my skill set to best fit that. And I didn't get selected, but it's one of those things where just by virtue of like forcing myself to think about that, made me sort of better appreciate the role that analysts must have to do, because it's like the first time you do something that somebody else has done for a long time. Even if you think, oh, this might not be as easy as it seems from the outside, it's oftentimes even more nuanced than you could ever imagine once you start to get used to it. So ultimately, I would love to do some broadcast event work, but I also don't hold any illusions that something like that could even happen. I would definitely have to do something more like pro bono, or maybe something with a really low wage involved for some of the much lower tier events in theory, if I wanted to work my way up to a dream hack or to anything higher than a dream hack as well. And the reason why I haven't pulled the trigger on that idea yet is because I've just been so busy doing all of the content creation. I definitely want to continue the content creation side of things. I think, like I was saying earlier about the financial sustainability, I'm not really 100% sure how my very specific definition of what a donation is in terms of like why you would be driven to donate. Like a lot of people do the Patreon thing because they have expectations of a response, some sort of like a payoff. And I'm trying to almost like sort of coax them in the direction of, hey, you're sending me money because you already got the content you're paying for. It's like I've actually delivered you the product already and you're just paying me late. That's almost how I'm kind of trying to get them to think about it. But obviously, like that's an angle that probably wouldn't work out for the average person. Like if you look at Thorin's Patreon, he's been able to essentially say, I'm going to provide you the X amount of value on top of you already getting my content, right? There's some things that are just like a small token of thanks. Maybe there's like some very, very small value, like Discord role or something that you get at like the $5 tier. And then after that, it's like, okay, well, now you can donate this amount of money to ask me a question and I'll answer it in a video. And he's actually done what I hope to do as well, where he's almost taken his Patreon opportunities and said, like, I'm going to actually turn this into more content. Like that's almost like that's a 200 IQ play for my money. It's like, wow, you managed to make it so that these people are paying you and you're making more content. And again, you're not going to make that much money off of YouTube anyway, but the fact that you're still able to make some return on there is like, it's almost like you're double dipping somehow. And I'm not sure how he managed to come up with that idea, but it's a pretty good one. So the problem there is, once again, I have to come up with a position where I have enough of a following where it doesn't seem almost desperate or in some other way negative that I'd be flaunting a Patreon and saying, hey, check this out. I think some of the more successful Patreon launches I've seen have been when people have a significant amount of following already, and then they dump into it, and then they're like, hey, check this out. You can do this. That's probably how I would have to go about it. On top of that, I would also need to make sure that I'm not overestimating the value that I can provide, where it says like you can donate X amount of money to get a question answered in an AMA video like Thorin style. That would have to be a situation where I know that when they ask a question, I can answer it and provide them some value. And it goes back to sort of what I was saying about in one of the earlier answers, where I have to make sure that I have studied enough and really applied myself enough so that I feel like I can provide some value with whatever I'm doing. So yeah, it's all about making sure that the value is there. I think right now the value has been there, and just in terms of the content itself, and I definitely look forward to continuing that into the long term. So we just got to figure out how to make it sustainable. That's all.
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of good points about kind of how difficult it can be in places. There's some things that definitely resonate with me on the side of like casting, where I think certainly some, like Thorin, like Launders, for example, had like a brand going into their casting analysis work kind of thing, but there's a lot of up and comers, as it were, around my kind of level, and I suppose Hawker would have been one of them, but now I feel has definitely broken away, and deservedly so, is down to that content creation, building the brand, building the following. I think some of the others, it's just kind of come with being a caster, and then you do it after the fact, whether it's Scrawny doing things with Blast that give him a little bit more that he can bring to the table or whatever. But now I think we're definitely finding that if you want to get noticed and whatnot, and I feel that might be part of the reason why Vu got picked up for the DreamHack stuff, is like definitely he is good at the role, and he was definitely very good. A little bit of getting into it after the first day, and obviously the situation is really awkward with your host being thousands of miles away and stuff like that. But I think that his YouTube channel, at the very least, with the following that he has, it just kind of is immediately like a box that you can tick, that it's like, okay, he says he knows what he's talking about, and now I can go and watch and make sure that he does. And obviously, like the short 3-minute show reel that I might have kind of shows in a sense, but if I want to come in and, you know, do some desk hosting stuff or on the stage or, you know, an actual interviewer, you have to kind of prove that. It's a very difficult role to get into without the evidence. And I think certainly having the content building your brand is pretty important. But then, like you say, trying to get it, I don't know how Thorin does it. Like, he pumps out so much content and works on Flashpoint and works for Flashpoint and is also consulting for Guild, apparently. You know what I mean? Like, he must not get as much sleep as the rest of us, which is fair. That's kind of what it's about. You know, Hex, the famous esports, is 24/7 for sure. But yeah, you really have to stick with it. And I think what you mentioned is some of the difficulties for like up and comers, where it's like, okay, I have a fiduciary responsibility to, you know, look after myself. Essentially, I can't just quit all that. So it's tough. It is tough.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to sort of echo is the idea that, well, I would almost look at it like you mentioned, how does Thorin do it? How do people like him do it? And I feel like, at least in my case, so if we go way back to when we were talking about my interest in Brood War, one of the things that the way that this is manifested is I've actually been, like, my main thing, if you can call it that, like my main hobby, my central hobby, that really consumed a lot of my time down the years, is the creation of those kinds of single player or cooperative scenarios for an RTS that I was talking about earlier. And not to labor that point too much in specific, but one of the things that I was able to come away with that was sort of recognizing how I can parlay that into something that shows my ability to dedicate myself to a certain kind of craft or to a certain, you know, say a schedule, if you will. And I'm, you know, not really that driven in a sense of, like, I can always guarantee that I wake up at the same time and that I go to bed at the same time. And, you know, taming the sleep schedule is always difficult. And I think a lot of creative people have that issue where they're like, maybe I should just stay up a couple extra hours and get more work done. But you almost have to, like, you know, discipline yourself to not do that. And so one of the things that I was able to do is, for an entire year, every single day, I was able to commit myself to 2 to 3, sometimes more hours of just streamed development hours put into some of these scenarios. Now, what that accomplishes ultimately is it shows me that, like, every excuse that I could come up with to not do a stream that day or to not get some more work done that day, like, they all eventually were able to fall away. Now, I'm in a way, I'm blessed. I didn't, like, suffer some grievous injury that would stop me. Like, there were no legitimate excuses, even if I was a little sick or whatever. I was basically able to tell myself, no, I can still get this done. And the lesson that I learned there was, like, if I can do that, and obviously I was in a position where I could still balance the work-life schedule around that, in theory, I could apply that same sort of learned, you know, I essentially learned something about myself in that I could be disciplined, I could be dedicated enough to a certain craft and to the content creation of a certain kind. If I can find another hobby that I'm as passionate about, which ends up being, in this case, CSGO content creation, then there's not really any way that I could imagine I wouldn't be able to succeed if I was able to carve out, like, the right kind of balance with a schedule. So to the point about Thorin, I think he's probably in a similar boat to what I'm talking about, where he's obviously been able to, like, the reason why I was even inspired to do the streak anyway is because Thorin has a video called My Unstoppable Streak of Thoughts, where he goes through and he talks about, he did like 90 or 100 days or something crazy of not every single day doing a Thorin's Thoughts video. And those have, like, I mean, obviously it's built up on the experience of everything that he's done up until that point.
Right.
But in theory, those are, like, still, that's a crazy thing to do, because you're imparting value that's based on not just how long the video is, but also how learned you are in the specific space that you're talking about. You're imparting that value, but doing it every single day. Like, that was the crazy thing for how long he did it. And so I was going to say, well, let's see how long I can go with a personal streak of my own, right? So the idea isn't necessarily about the streak of days uninterrupted, although you could certainly make a case that that's a very impressive feat. The idea is more so, like, can you come up with an excuse to stop working? And, like, how good do you feel about yourself for it? Like, do you really feel like there's nothing you could have done differently? Like, how do you make sure that you don't stop working, essentially? And when it comes to that, I feel like when you find the way to say that there is nothing that would stop me, like, you live a healthy enough life that you're not going to be crippled with some sort of ailment. You're able to balance the schedule. You're able to balance the finances. You're able to do all these other things. Then in theory, you could always be doing something. And that's, I think that's been a big lesson of the last year or so, because that streak ended back in November. And just the fact that I was able to do it for that long, it's almost like building up confidence in yourself as a person or as a creator, and being able to say that I can actually do that. So yeah, I mean, the main concern for me is just like how long I'll be able to go at it at this rate that I've been able to go at it for, and that will fall away once the finances dry up and I have to go back into the workforce, like I said. So I'm sort of biding my time until then and still trying to produce the highest value content and looking towards in the future something that could be sustainable, something that could go in a different way. And I have some ideas about that. I'm sure we could talk about like some of the other content that works into that way. But as far as, you know, what's going to happen afterwards, if it has to go back to me doing it on occasion and balancing out a work-life schedule again, I've already been able to do that for the better part of a year. I see no reason why I wouldn't be able to do it again. So it's almost like, again, it's like once you do it once, you can kind of convince yourself that you can do it again. And that's essentially where I'm at in my own sort of mental space, I guess.
Yeah, finding, I think, motivation really is a difficult one. Speaking from personal experience, without getting too much into like, you know, psychoanalysis or whatever, it's kind of hard. I think for me, it's always a fear of like, I guess the failure. You talked about it a little bit earlier, right? And insecurity about uploading the content. Who's gonna really respect it and listen? And I kind of have the same sort of thing in a lot of ways. It's difficult. It's difficult, but I think, yeah, finding the motivation, finding that inspiration, I guess, creative inspiration as well, is kind of another side of it. You know, you could do your long form analytical interviews all the time, but I think eventually you'd probably like dry up of that, you know, either yourself or just people to bring on or whatever. And I suppose that segues us into the next area that we'll talk about, is the fact that you do have some interesting content ideas. I don't know if you want to share any of the ones that you might have in the back of your head at the moment, but certainly one that piqued my interest, and I think I caught it on the stream a week or so ago, is the map development that you look into and the custom maps, because it is something at the moment that CS is, I suppose, one of the only games in the space that has a big enough scene for. Valorant have come out and said that they're not really looking to move towards that. They have some, you know, custom map makers, not just in-house people that they've trained or whenever they pulled some people from CS, but it's not something that they're looking to open up to the community just yet. Whereas, of course, Valve, whether you agree or not, are very, very hands-off and like to open it up. So moving into that, is it something that you're interested in? I suppose, I think I know what your answer is going to be fair, from what we've talked about with Brood War. But why did you decide to move towards the map creation stuff in the end?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying, my understanding, like sort of looking at the content that I was consuming and then finding gaps in where I would like to see content, but there is none. That was basically one of the main things. And based on my history with the Brood War custom content, and I had always been, you know, for the most part, interested in community maps. As soon as I realized that some community maps actually get added to the official map pool, I started to think about like the ramifications of a really good community map being released might actually impact pro play. We haven't really seen that, unfortunately, besides cash, but you know, like the idea of it potentially being the case, especially a couple of years back when I first got into Counter-Strike, that was when I was realizing, oh yeah, like this actually could be a big deal, and maybe people should be spending a bit more time on it. And we've seen some channels do map analysis videos, but I took the plunge on that actually on an older channel a year ago, when there was a mapping contest where that actually created Swamp, Chlorine, and Anubis, which were all added to the map pool at various points. Anubis is still in the map pool, and some of the others might actually still be there. I haven't paid too much attention to what's in the current active duty pool, but I do know that you can actually play Anubis in matchmaking. And so back a year or so ago, I was actually going through essentially the top 10 or so, according to the judges of that contest, and running through the maps and essentially like playing some games on it, and then recording an analysis video where I just walk through the map and give my thoughts. And that was before that, I had done just 2 other videos that were in a similar vein that just happened to be inspired by some people releasing their maps, and I think they got upvoted to the front page of the Global Offensive subreddit, and I was like, oh well, I'll just check those out because they're there. And then I thought, well, I actually have some ideas that might help. Obviously I've seen that the mapper is still actively working on this map. Maybe I can influence them to, at least think about some of the ideas that I might have, or maybe some of the things that I make points on will be helpful to the developer. And I just sort of try to do it in that sense, where any flaws that I'm pointing out are like, here's some reasons why that's like a problem. Like, try to essentially give, again, the value, or convince them that I know what I'm talking about enough so that they can take my point seriously. And then ideally in a constructive manner, so that hopefully they don't get too upset that I'm pointing out an issue in their map that they probably spent a long time on. Because for those who aren't aware, it does take a very long time to make CS maps, way more so than like the 1.6 days where it was much easier, just because of the sort of visual standard that the game now expects. So given all that, that's essentially, I started that in 2019, like early 2019 with the first two videos, and then a bit closer to just a calendar year ago for the other contest. And I sort of staved off any sort of interest until I started up the newer channel, which is where all the interviews are coming from and all that stuff. And I decided it might be good early on, if I do intend to go into the mapping space and make content in the mapping space, it's probably a good idea to let people know that that's something that they can expect on this channel, as well as the esports stuff, as well as the industry topics and the interviews and everything else that I've been doing. So as far as the mapping side of things goes, it was almost like I knew that if I just started doing this all of a sudden later on, it would almost seem like out of left field for the subscriber base. And I wanted to make sure that people expected map related content alongside some of the other content that I was doing, and they could just pick and choose which videos they were interested in. And I mean, indeed, that's the whole reason why I split the channel to be more CSGO sided from the original main channel, which has all the RTS stuff on it. So it's almost like splitting them apart, because they are so disparate that there isn't really that much crossover. Whereas when it comes to if at least everything is related to CS, in theory, there's going to be a bit more crossover there. So yeah, to your point about the Valve being hands off, obviously that has its own drawbacks, which is the fact that the community maps haven't really seen that much attention from Valve. We haven't had them even be really associated with operations in a while. Even the most recent operation, from memory, all of the maps that were in the map pool had already been added before that operation. So it wasn't even like there was anything new besides one of Valve's own maps, which is just for one of those arms race game modes or something. It wasn't for competitive. So it was a combination of my own personal interest in the subject, and also recognizing nobody else was really doing it to the same degree of quality that I thought I could eventually get to. And because of my background focusing on competitive Brood War maps and stuff like that, I realized I actually am pretty well fitted, sort of like I cut my teeth on Brood War stuff, and I've already figured out how to phrase the feedback that I'm going to give so that it can be best received. And essentially, you don't have to go easy on people necessarily, but ideally you can phrase it in such a way that it's not going to needlessly ruffle any feathers, and that way everybody can sort of take the right kind of message from it. They can at least understand what you mean. So I got my teeth cut in that respect, and figured all that stuff out, and jumped over to the CSGO map stuff with the intention of creating content that I felt wasn't being created to the same standard as it ought to have been, but also about community content that could in theory have as much of an impact as possible on the space, if you imagine Valve actually gets off their asses and starts adding some of these maps to the map pool or changing some stuff up. So yeah, based on that, that was essentially the main impetus to start working on the map content. And the point that you made about the stream stuff is I was able to essentially take Anubis, which is a map that's not only been added to the game, but also is competitive. You can play on it in a competitive, in competitive matchmaking. And so because of that competitive context to it, I was able to say, this is a situation where I could actually bring on the developers and have them explain some stuff about the map itself. And that's where the First Person Mapper show came up. And we decided to explore that with the co-host Cat Food, who's also responsible for a bunch of maps, some of which have been added to the game, like Shipped and Ruby, and there's probably one or two others that I'm forgetting. But yeah, a lot of the space there was just I knew this kind of content didn't exist because I had looked for it. And I knew it probably should exist, because if I'm looking for it, I can't be the only one looking for it. There's probably going to be interest elsewhere. And that sort of, it went from there to just seeing how far I could go. And I'm still not really sure how far it's going to go, but that's just more content for the channel in a way that is definitely providing value in a different angle. Like we talked about earlier, where you kind of need to, create your own niche in a sense. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do there.
Yeah, I think a running theme that just throughout the interview and even in some of the information, you told me beforehand when we were first talking about getting this together, is just the fact that you are wanting to create, I suppose, to use your own phrase, really, is content that, you don't see, that you can't find. And we've touched a little bit on the long term. Is it something that, you're trying to find something that sticks, or is it more that, I suppose in a way, Thorin, I think, is very much an inspiration. We'll not, talk about him too much on this, but like he has that kind of philosophy of, not to speak for him, but it certainly looks like he has the philosophy of, doing as much content as possible with as many different ideas as possible as well, not just pumping it out. It's not all Thorin's thoughts, for example, right? He has like a lot of different, and you already have, your one-on-one interview show, very recently looking into more of the industry side of things. Obviously, we just touched on the map stuff there. The Medal Makers is another one, right, where you've brought more members of like the same events and whatnot to talk over what they're working on and things like that. Maui's made quite a few appearances. Alan was on the other day, right? Is it something that you're also trying to emulate? Is doing like a myriad of content where there's a lot of different areas that you're trying to pull from, or I suppose in a way with the map content and stuff, it definitely does give that idea of wanting to expand beyond the norm. And I guess to fully phrase the question, it would just end up coming down to, is there anything that you have planned that has not been seen before?
Yeah, so when it comes to the content ideas where the things that have not yet been seen before, I would actually say I'm drawing a lot of inspiration from content that is outside of the CS space that I think the CS space actually could benefit from. So the Metal Makers is intended eventually to be something similar to the Summoning Insight League of Legends show that Thorin and Monte Cristo do together, where basically, if people aren't aware of the origin of the show, it was Thorin recognized Monty's analytical talent and said, this guy can give a lot back to the space when it comes to that analytical stuff. Basically, there's an he's under interviewed or under exploited in terms of his analysis, and more could be done there. And he recognized that and decided he would play the host. He would ask some questions that maybe might be considered a little dumb or crass or underinformed, but it would allow Monte Cristo to then show his own sort of side there. And I thought that that's like a perfect angle for me coming into the CS space, where I am familiar enough with the game that I can ask certain kinds of questions, but I'm also open to the idea that the analysts might contradict something that I say, or they might, like, maybe I'll phrase a question as if it was a 50-50, like maybe this team could beat that other team. And then famously, like on the most recent Metal Makers show, I asked Maui Snake, like, could Dignitas ever beat Fnatic or something like that? And one of the analysts was just like, no. And then went into their explanation as to why. So it was a nice bit of where I'm trying to sell the idea. I'm trying to be like, oh, maybe it could be. And then they're able to shut me down. And if that's the case, then that shows off their analysis chops in that way. Like, then you at least know that they really mean it, because they were given every opportunity to say otherwise. So that's essentially the inspiration I'm taking for that particular show. And eventually I want it to be like, essentially as hype in a way as the Summoning Insight stuff is, where you get players of all sorts of teams, coaches, support staff coming in. And I've got another one planned that's going to be all support staff coming up later on this week. So there's all sorts of different examples of content that I think the CS scene could definitely benefit more from. I also think the fact that it's a live show is something that is not exploited enough in CS. And in general, I think there's an element of that I'm not sure if HLTV Confirmed or By the Numbers, for example, really do lay into it that much. Sometimes Richard will see a really dumb Twitch chat message and yell at them for it, which is great content. But when it comes to HLTV, maybe some of the hosts will read some messages and like incorporate some of their ideas into the questions that they ask the guest or something to that effect. But for the most part, I think it's almost superfluous that it's live. It's not really leaned into as much. Whereas the Metal Makers has a pre-show that's live only, so we essentially are shooting the shit. None of it's going on anybody's permanent record, and the VOD, that gets cut from the VOD afterwards when it goes on YouTube. After the fact, we have a Q&A section which does get added to the VOD, but that's a situation where I just pick questions from the chat, similar to the Flashpoint Q&As, and I say, like, here's a question that I think is interesting. What do you guys have to say about this? Try to maybe change the question if it needs to be changed for the maximum impact or something like that. That's a situation where I feel like as an occasional live viewer of these shows, it's not necessarily that I wanted them to answer all the questions that I had in mind, but I wasn't even thinking about interacting in that way because I knew it wasn't really going to result in anything more likely than not, right? There was no real avenue for somebody who's live to even through donations or something like that ask a sort of question. They would have to be beforehand in the Patreon section for By the Numbers. It would have to be beforehand for HLTV Confirmed to like respond to tweets or something, which is great for engagement prior to the show, great for sustainability financially, but not really so great for actually capitalizing on the fact that you are a live show indeed. So that was a case where I think that a lot of shows could have benefited from taking the live approach and going that route. I also think that it gives the show a very different flavor because it's live. It also certainly changes my own expectations as a host. It's almost like I'm trying to level up the hype or the, maybe not minimize dead air necessarily, but like try to give a purpose to all of the material because I know it's being consumed then and there. It's not in some vacuum where it'll be consumed after the fact. So there's a lot of things that change as a result of it being a live show as well. And even though right now we've been focusing on Flashpoint because Maui Snake has been a sort of rotating co-host, it's not something that I think will be, it's not necessarily going to be focused on events as much as it is going to be focused on really, focusing on what the guests or co-hosts or whatever for that week can talk about. And that to me has been a really important aspect that I also think like a lot of the shows that have co-hosts or guests don't necessarily capitalize on the fact that they're there. I mean, the meme for HLTV Confirmed is that they've got Sponge and some cardboard cutouts. And maybe that's unfair, maybe that's too extreme. But when it comes to the end result, it doesn't feel like those two necessarily will have the same kind of impact that they could have if the show leaned into their presence a bit more, if they structured some questions around their inclusion and those individual specialities. And, the idea that especially a show like that's been as long running as it has been still has that flaw in a sense. I mean, I don't even think that they've necessarily leaned into the meme as much as they could have. They could have at least tried to make it like a funny inside joke or try to embrace it the same way that some other people have, like obviously Flusha embraced the lifted meme and stuff. So like there's all sorts of things that you could be doing in ways that sort of capitalize on the personality and the cast of people, the roster that's on the show. That doesn't always happen, and sometimes the co-host or the actual host will occasionally maybe ask some questions that just don't fly with the guests. Like maybe it's an NA guest and you ask him an EU question or vice versa. Mm-hmm. I've seen that happen all over the place as well. So there's definitely a case where this was a lesson that I learned with Peaker's Advantage, where a lot of the time Davey would specifically ask some questions or sometimes specifically ignore some news stories or results that were more recent because he knew that the guest didn't know that much about it or hadn't watched it or, wasn't comfortable answering those questions or whatever the case may be. And it sounds like a mundane thing to do, but I don't think it's leaned into as much the opposite way where you specifically structure the show around asking them specific things about it. So, obviously I focused a lot on the metal makers with this answer, but I do think that that's an angle where the CS scene is sort of has been undersold in terms of how the kinds of content that we could have. And, it doesn't even necessarily have to be me. If somebody else, does it better, I might just be like, oh, hats off to you. This is great content that I can watch now. But since nobody else is doing it in that same way that I want it to see it done, and since I believe that it will end up being of some value and to the point where it can exist alongside all these other shows, live or otherwise, that are pretty big, that's essentially been my motivation to start on that topic and to go deep with the content that isn't just interviews. And another thing too is that while interviews are great and they can have a lot of value, they are sometimes predicated on knowing that there's a news story and a guest that you can combine to make something topical. Like the most recent one that I did with Tolkien Fanatic is about the NA scene, and people like that's a topical event, and this is a guy that knows a lot about the NA scene and he can speak to it. And that's a situation where you can sort of, the stars have aligned in a sense, and that's not always going to happen. So to your point about earlier that you made about like, you can make interviews, day in, day out to the end of time, but eventually you're probably going to run dry. It's not even necessarily that you might run out of questions to ask. It could be that you run out of interesting guests to have on, or you run out of topics to discuss with those guests. And at that point, it's almost a good idea to diversify the kinds of content that you do, which is why I've been leaning more so into some of the mapping stuff, some of the talk shows, and the more recent industry-related talk show that I did, Esports Samaritans, where the idea is there's a hot topic issue that is pressing a lot of people. Let's get some people who are either knowledgeable or heavily impacted or both by that topic and get their opinions on it. And I just field questions and I try to be an avatar for the layman who doesn't necessarily know that much about things, but by virtue of me asking certain kinds of questions to certain kinds of people, we can hopefully get some answers and some, maybe even some solutions to problems. Like the idea is that you have enough specifically themed shows that you never really run out of things to talk about, and that's how you make sure that your content itself is sustainable in the long run, where you don't need to rely on, again, the stars aligning in specific areas.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to break down, right? In terms of, I think, integrating the live elements is a pretty big part, because I think it is something that certainly Flashpoint are pushing towards, in a sense, the blind spot and everything, but then bringing in chat questions, chat interaction, I definitely think is something that a lot of people, if you speak to maybe people who are like sort of non-endemic to esports and want to get involved, and it's like, oh, well, how can we ultimately, like your business types, how can we monetize that? But there's definitely that angle of actually getting live viewers, more live chatters, I suppose, more heavily involved in the content that's being created. So it's a bit more of not like a casual affair, but like an inclusive kind of thing, if that makes sense, is sort of the energy that I'm getting from what you were saying. It's like, yes, you can have questions come in from other people, but I don't know, you maybe have time to prepare for those. You maybe can send them off a little bit early. It's sort of a bit more off the cuff and natural, I guess, is a good way of putting it, when you heavily lean into more of the live elements, as it were. So, and I think you're certainly trying to find a lot of inspiration from different areas. There's some of the things that I noticed that definitely resonated with me is the idea of using the people a little bit more rather than Counter-Strike or esports or whatever it may be, if that makes sense. So you bring someone in and focus a bit more heavily on what they're saying. Like you're saying with the whole topical stuff, I think it can be quite almost easy to fall into that trap of bringing the wrong people in for the wrong topics, if that makes sense, and you try and get their outside opinion on it. But sometimes I suppose this is what you're going to go with later on in the week as well, right? Where you bring more support staff and stuff like that. Asking them about like mechanics of the game and things is perhaps slightly more redundant than asking simple, how to get sick aim and that kind of thing. So I think it's a really interesting approach that you have to making content, being smart about it, not just pulling in big names and trying to force a triangle into a circle space, if that makes sense. So yeah. I suppose it brings us closer to the end. I was just kind of, I suppose if you've got a rebuttal, like, go for that, yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to say the idea of, you made it a really nice, like, you tied it up in a nice little bow when you said that you're using the guests or the people who are on the show more than you're using Counter-Strike or esports or whatever essentially like the facade or the reason why you're there in the first place. I feel like people have misplaced what the purpose of a lot of the shows are, because with Summoning Insight, like the example I gave earlier, the purpose was, let's take this, analyst who could be a star analyst who might not be yet. In my case, we started off with Maui Snake with the Metal Makers, and we know that this guy's good. We know he can give really good analysis. Let's ask him the questions. Now the show is about him more so than it is about the latest event, the latest team to bomb out of a tournament, the latest team to win a tournament. It's more about what does this person sort of transform those events or those news stories or whatever the case may be. How does that person, how are they able to deliver a different kind of take than you're ever going to get anywhere else? And it kind of goes back to the unique angle of it. Like, how unique is your content? Well, your content's going to be infinitely more unique if people are there for the people and not necessarily for the topic. In a sense, everybody's already agreed with that, because that's why we get big name guests on. That's why, my interview with, Vu is lower in views than my interview with Richard Lewis, because like they have different following amounts. But in theory, like what really changes from, guest to guest or show to show is how you structure the show around the people that you're having to come in and spending time with them. And I guess, not to dig on HLTV Confirmed too much, but when they have Launders on and they ask him questions about like a team that maybe he didn't even watch because he was casting another event, or they don't ask him as many questions about fixing the game or his thoughts on like the ecosystem. Like that guy has got tons of really interesting ideas, and he's going to have tons of insights as well. But that it's almost like the hosts themselves feel a little bit pressured to talk about everything that happened recently, and they want to break down everything, and that's what's on their docket. And that's sort of the vibe that I've gotten. Now, obviously, they haven't gotten that far as maybe I'm making it sound like, but that's the vibe that I'm getting from like the back end. And again, sort of like the insight that you get when you're producing or also hosting some of these shows and putting together the notes and stuff. It's like you start to see when maybe somebody's forcing an angle, like you said, a triangle into a circle or something like that, where it just isn't necessarily going to fit. So that's my main goal when it comes to all of my shows, is to like lean into the people who I have on. But there you do have to have some consistent elements. In this case, it's just Counter-Strike or the latest events or whatever, and you're almost using that again as like a facade, a sort of like here's the reason why we're all here to talk about stuff, but the people who are here to talk, that's really the star of the show, so to speak.
So a trend that I'm going to start at the end of these videos is to just ask my guests the exact same 10 questions every time, paying homage to James Lipton, the host of Inside the Actors Studio, for anyone that's seen that. But I just think it's kind of a nice, quick fire set of questions to go with. And I hope you're ready, Pr0nogo.
Yeah, the only question I have is do I have to give reasons for it, or can I just say it and stop it?
Just completely off the cuff, not as quick as you can, but relatively short answers is the goal here.
Gotcha.
Okay, cool. So, question number 1. What is your favorite word?
I'll say simulation.
Okay. Question 2. What is your least favorite word?
Anders.
What turns you on creatively?
I should say Anders again. No, I think turns me on creatively. Stuff that's really just like experimental and somehow works. So I would say all of the Flashpoint skits. Very experimental. Somehow they work.
What turns you off?
Well, this one doesn't say creatively, so...
Well, in the same vein.
Oh, okay. Let's see. I would say trying the same thing over and over again because somebody else told you to. Or anything that's somebody else told you to do it and you do it without analyzing it.
What sound or noise do you love?
When I pop open a peanut butter jar, there's a very specific sound that I can't recreate it. It's just a nice pop that's very unique.
Yeah, I know it well. What sound or noise do you hate?
I'll say when my knife goes to the bottom of the peanut butter jar and I feel the clink of the glass, just to keep it consistent here.
Brilliant. What is your favorite curse word?
I'll just say cunt because I don't get to say it as often as you Brits do, and I'm jealous.
Yeah, it's a lot harsher, I suppose, over the pond at the end of the day.
For some reason, yeah, I'm not sure why.
Just the way it is. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I would like to attempt to be I'd like to attempt to be a coach of a professional team. It's obviously somewhat linked to the esports thing, but I think more so because it would be so difficult to actually do it properly, and it's definitely not really where my skill set necessarily lies, but I want to test myself. So I'll say coach.
And what profession would you not like to do?
Oh, there's so many answers to this one. I'll say I would really not like to be a game tester because from what I've seen, all of their feedback is sent through lawyers before it's sent through developers. So you have no chance that your shit is actually going to get acted upon. Yeah. And so that's like pouring water into a glass and then pouring it back into another glass. It's just a bullshit job.
Yeah, fair enough. So question number 10, the final question, I suppose a little heavier than the rest of them, just to prep you and the viewer. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
So there's a really old joke that it goes the way of there's a giant flood and he's very religious. He stands on his roof. A boat comes by, like a rowboat, a paddle boat, and they say, "Hey, get on." And the man says, "I'm a religious man. God will save me." And so they fly off. They swim off. A helicopter comes down, lowers the ladder. Get in. We can evacuate you. He says, I'm a religious man. God will save me. Now, eventually, he drowns and he goes to heaven and he says, but I'm a religious man. Why didn't God save me? And God replies, I gave you a boat and a fucking helicopter. What more do you need? So that's what I want him to say to me. I gave you so many chances. What do you need?
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. Pr0nogo really giving some great long-form answers there, honestly, with a lot to break down, a lot for me to learn from, and I'm sure a lot for you guys to learn about him and some of the ideas that he's got for content creation and whatnot. I know the Medal Makers episode that he was talking about with Mahone and Anton are the guests. He didn't mention that in the interview, but that episode is out now, which is why I know who the guests are. So do be sure to go check that out. I'm going to drop all the links, of course, in the description. Also, would appreciate a sub, a like, a comment, especially. Let me know what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. If you like the 10 questions segment, want to see that again, because I am hoping to pull it out time after time. But yeah, let me know how you feel about that. Maybe let me know who else you want on the show as well, some questions you'd want me to ask them. Other than that, I don't have too much to add, apart from thanks for watching, of course, and make sure you tune in for episode 2. It'll be out soon. You've got to be subbed so you can see it, of course. But I will see you in the second episode.